Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss. Thank you so much for listening. Beyond Organic Wine is a podcast and a Substack about the ecology of wine, the future of wine, and the regenerative renaissance as seen through the lens of wine. If you're ready to go on a journey that leaves traditional wine thought far behind and explores the edges and margins of viticulture that can change the way we not only grow wine, but the way we think and understand our role as part of the ecosystem of wine, then this podcast will probably light your fire. If you'd like to support this podcast and the work that goes into each episode, please subscribe to the Beyond Organic Wine Substack at beyondorganicwine.substack.com. And you'll also get full access to all the podcasts, resources, and writing that happen there. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, please email me at connect@organicwinepodcast.com. And last but definitely not least, please follow and leave a great review in your podcast app. It's immensely helpful. Thank you so much for your support. I'm really excited to announce that early bird tickets, discounted early bird tickets for Embracing Hybrid Grapes in California will go on sale this week at embracinghybridgrapes.com. Check it out. If you haven't heard, Embracing Hybrid Grapes in California is happening at UC Davis in January 26, 2026, this January. It's going to be a lot of fun. And if you want to be the first to know about the tickets, follow us on Instagram, Embracing Hybrid Grapes. My guest for this episode is Alder Yarrow. Alder writes and does everything for the blog Vinography. And I've been receiving Alder's weekly email for several years. He gives a list of links of articles he's been reading, and I always enjoy scanning this list to see what's going on in the wine zeitgeist. Alder's vinography.com blog has been published daily since 2004 and was nominated for a James Beard Award in 2013. Since 2011, Alder has also been a monthly columnist for Jancis Robinson, where he also contributes wine reviews for American wines. Alder has been judging competitions for many years and spent nearly a decade as a judge for the World of Fine Wine's annual Global Restaurant Wine List Awards and for the James Beard Restaurant Awards. His coffee table book of essays and photographs, The Essence of Wine, was named one of the best wine books of 2014 by the New York Times and won the Chairman's Prize at the 2015 Louis Roederer International Wine Writers Awards. In 2013, Alder was inducted into the Wine Media Guild of New York's Wine Writers Hall of Fame, an honor he shares with only 24 other living wine writers. He is also a member of the Circle of Wine Writers. Alder was an architect of and serves as the day-to-day manager for the Old Vine Registry, the world's first and most authoritative public database of old vine vineyards around the globe. I reached out to Alder for this conversation because of a comment he made about the recent Eric Asimov article about hybrid grapes. I gave Alder questions in advance, so he knew I wanted to challenge him on several ideas. To his credit, he still agreed to this conversation, and you're about to listen to the results. Though I think we share most of the same values and agree about a lot, we don't agree about everything, and that's why I wanted to talk to him. I hope that makes sense. You have to get out of your own echo chamber if you want to learn, and if you care about truth. And more, you have to actively seek the company of those who disagree with you if you want to break free of the control of algorithms, if you want to cultivate diversity. So I'm grateful to Alder for being game and taking the time to have this conversation/debate. And if you listen until the end, I'm also including, as an epilogue, the verbatim exchange that we had via email after the conversation. As I re-listened to a specific part of the recorded conversation while editing, I realized I wanted to make a comment about something that I had let slide. But I wanted him to be able to respond to that comment. So stay tuned at the end if you're interested in hearing more. Enjoy. Alder, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you doing this. I want to welcome you to Beyond Organic Wine, and thank you.
Really happy to be here.
And my first question for you is, did you have hippie parents?
Well, the name is sort of a giveaway, isn't it? I was in fact born on an intentional community, aka commune, in Sonoma County in California, and I was born under an alder tree, which is how I got my first name. And then my parents weren't married, hippies as they were, and they decided I needed my own last name. So they came up with Yarrow. I'm named after the herb, the stems of which have traditionally been used to throw the I Ching hexagram for
Oh,
centuries.
well, I don't know how well you are familiar with biodynamics, but it's a big herb in biodynamics as well.
Well, yes, and I'm actually the ultimate biodynamic wine critic because I believe it's preparation 503. You put the yarrow in the red deer bladder and hang it in an alder tree.
There you
So
go. Yes.
there you go.
Yep. I love that. Well, cool. Thank you so much. I I guess if I mean there's so many ways I could do this. I will have, sort of read your introduction in the introduction. And I want to jump right into the juicy stuff, but I think, just to get some things from your sort of perspective, I'd love to, just get a sense of how your wine journey has developed. If I can say some nice things about you, which I would love to do, I think as one of the pioneer wine bloggers, sort of helped with the democratization of wine information and wine reviewing. I mean, obviously there a lot of things went into that, but as one of the main people back in the day and who continues on to today, I also started a wine blog in 2004, and I should have kept at it because I had good traffic, but things changed in my life. But yeah, I think your role as a blogger has been really important to wine in general, and just wanted to hear how you got excited about wine in the first place and where that has taken you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think there's some truth to that. I don't like to self-aggrandize and make it seem like I changed the face of wine writing and criticism, but I definitely was, if not the cause, certainly a symptom, one of the symptoms of a new
Mm,
era in wine communication, and sort of followed that journey through a pretty major change in the world of wine and wine
yeah.
communication. But I started as a passionate consumer. So I had a few tastes of wine growing up, nothing sort of revelatory, and frankly, I didn't care for it very much. And then in my junior year of college, I was studying abroad in England, and I realized quite definitively that I don't really like beer, which I'd known for a while. Sort of standing around in the corner at keggers in high school with nothing to drink. And so, also the food in the early 90s in England that they were serving in the colleges was pretty awful.
Mm,
Kind of what I always imagined prison food to be like. And so I started cooking in the small kitchen that I had access to. And I thought, here I am. I'm this young intellectual in Europe. Shouldn't I be drinking wine with my dinner? And so I went down to the local bottle shop, and like many people early in their wine journey, was far too intimidated to talk to anybody or even make eye contact, and I would just grab things off the bottom shelf that I could afford that looked interesting and pop them open at home and taste them with my food, and enjoy them, or not enjoy them, as some case may be. And when I came back from England and finished my studies and went out and got a job, I just decided to spend all my pocket money on food and wine, and started taking notes about the things that I enjoyed, and going up and visiting wineries in wine country, and cooking for myself, teaching myself how to really cook, because the cooking I was doing in college was jarred spaghetti sauce and dried spaghetti and things like that. And so I fell in love with wine, and I essentially over the next 10 years became kind of the wine geek amongst my circle of friends, the guy that everybody would hand the wine list to whenever we went out to dinner. And I fell in love. And my whole career has been in digital marketing, user experience design, product design. And so in the early 2000s, I had clients starting to ask me, well, what are these blog things? How do they work? Should we have one? Do you need to build one for us? And I realized I better figure that out. And so just to learn, I started my own blog, and it didn't take me very much time to figure out if I was going to blog about something, what it would be. And that was the birth of Vinography.
nice. And it's been vinography the whole time.
Yes, that's a word I coined. I wish I had taken a screenshot of my Google search for the term vinography with zero results back in 2004, but I didn't. So you have to take my word for it.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, right. When starting back then. I still have Gmail that are actually my name, because you could do that back then,
Right.
and that kind of thing. Like my blog was Pinot Now, and I since expanded my interest beyond Pinots, which is part of why I abandoned the blog. But that didn't take very long either. And which makes me ask, like, what what have been your guiding lights as you've traveled through time and through your journey learning about wine? Like, what fascinated you? What subjects you know do you like to talk about now? I mean, maybe that obviously you can talk about how that might have changed, but and are there values behind those subjects? Like, what guides that?
I have a set of sort of ethics, philosophies, passions, whatever you want to call them when it comes to wine. And that first and foremost is really about sort of curiosity and pleasure. I am still in love with wine the way that I was in love with wine when I first got excited about it. I love that you can taste so many things in a glass. I think wine's pretty magical that, just from grapes and sunlight and a little time and maybe some oak, you can have a liquid that tastes, of chocolate or raspberries or all these things that, were nowhere involved in the making of it. And that also can speak to some sort of locality, the place that it comes from, the hands that made it, all the effort and culture that went into the creation of that wine in that place. And I think that's endlessly fascinating. And the fact that that's multiplied literally in the tens of thousands and millions around the world is what's magical about wine. You can travel the world in a wine glass. There's so much variety, so much diversity, so many more things to discover and learn. That's always been, and I hope will always be, my MO when it comes to wine. Um, my wine journey has been like many people's. Starting out with pretty commercial supermarket wines that I could afford early in my career. And then as I earned more money and got more into wine and realized, oh God, if I spend $30 a bottle, it's a lot better than, the $18 a bottle or whatever.
Yeah.
Working my way up that value chain. I've certainly come to admire and appreciate the artisan side of wine, made by real people in small quantities from specific places with interesting stories behind them that make those wines meaningful and memorable. And as far as my writing, I've always tried to focus on that story because I do believe it's what makes wine meaningful and memorable. And there are amazing stories behind wines, and so those have attracted me, led the way, sort of been my guiding lights, if you will, in writing about wine. The stories, the people, the places, and how they're all intertwined. And um, I have pretty Catholic tastes in wine in the sense that I like a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And I also try not to be dogmatic about it in the sense that I'm there are great wines that are made with pesticides and herbicides, and while I'd prefer people not to make those choices, uh, the wines are fantastic, and the I have to acknowledge that and appreciate that, and those people have stories and reasons they do what they do. And then there are wines that are made much more on the, as to use your moniker here, beyond organic side of the universe, and those are amazing and special too for their own reasons. But one of
I
the
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I just was gonna say, I assume you're saying that knowing probably my tastes are different in that sense, like that I.
Well, yeah, and I mean, here we are on a podcast called Beyond Organic Wine. So I've taken a look at some of the stuff that you focus on.
Yeah.
So I tend to sort of open my arms up wide and be pretty humble about the fact that I don't have to make a living farming and making wine, and those who do, you know, have to feed their families and have all sorts of extenuating circumstances that I'm not privy to, so I can't judge and be dogmatic, you know, beyond a certain point. Like I can say, yeah, you know, you should not use glyphosate, but you know, there are some people that using systemics like that is the difference between feeding their family and not. And at the end of the day, the humanist in me says, well, you can't condemn somebody for doing that.
I mean, I agree in one sense that I definitely think it's really important to keep people farming. Like I think we need people farming these
Mm-hmm.
days. I disagree in the sense that like when you know that it's possible, and maybe I come from a little more viticultural experience. I have worked in vineyards. I do grow grapes. When you know it's possible to do it another way successfully, it's it really just becomes a choice. Like what I see is not necessity, but actually just a voluntary choice. And that's from my experience, what I've
Yeah,
seen talking with people about this from every area around the planet.
yeah, and I think, you know, it's the world is not black and white, and I
For
think
sure.
it's it's easy to say that and not so easy to do that in so many walks of life. Like, for instance, something that I think you and I probably agree on is that, you know, there's really no need to use commercial yeasts in winemaking, right? Like natural yeasts and ambient yeasts from the vineyard can make absolutely fantastic wines. And there's an irrational fear in large chunks of the wine industry about using native yeasts.
Right, right.
That's kind of my point of view, but and I, you know, whenever I get the opportunity and have the kind of relationship with a winemaker where I'm like, you know, you really ought to try fermenting, you know, natively, you know, it's I think you get a better result. I mean, in my opinion, right? So I share those kinds of opinions, but at the end of the day, I can't judge or condemn somebody for choosing to use commercial yeast. You
I
know,
mean, the funny thing is that that's where I'm least dogmatic. I mean, in terms of that, like in terms of the winemaking, is where I'm sort of like, look, if you've done incredible stuff out in the field, then you know what you do in the cellar is a you know impacts the world far less than all of your farming choices. And so
sure,
if you want to add yeast, great. Like I mean, that's to me, you've done the important thing by farming organically or better. And yeah, and
sure.
I mean, yeah. So I mean, I just say that as a ironic, funny.
Yeah. And let's we'll talk about farming and because it is it's very important. But just as an example of something that often is associated with dogmatic stances in the wine world, I picked
Right,
that as an
right,
example, which is to
yeah,
say, you know, I think we can judge people for that, you know, and you know there are pretty marginal places in the world, you know, that people grow grapes, and this can be a bridge into a conversation about hybrids if you want, but where you know their decision to try and make Pinot Noir at sort of the edge of viability, or you know Riesling or something like that, means that they can't just use you know copper and sulfur. They got to do something else if they want to get a crop at the end of the year, um, with those grapes. And I, you know, I respect and admire those choices, and you know, especially when they yield phenomenal results in the bottle and in the glass. You know, if you're making shitty wine and you're, you know, using all these horrible things, well, then you know, there's bigger problems. But you
right.
know, I've certainly had my share of you know truly fantastic wines made from places that you know it's pretty hard to be fully organic. And I'm you know, and I'm not an apologist for chemical farming. I think it's awful. It's not good for the planet. It's not good for humans. But I'm also more of a pragmatist when it comes to those things, and I believe um, that it's all shades of gray, and you can't be black and white about such things.
So apropos to that, I am sipping on a hybrid wine made grown here in the Finger Lakes biodynamically without sulfur or copper and made as a 0 wine. Um, and it's lovely. It's actually been open in my fridge for over a week or for about a week, and it's still perfect. Like, not, I mean, obviously it's changed, but you know, it hasn't gone mousy or weird or anything like that. It's Pompilano Pink from Usonia here in the Finger Lakes. They're one of the few people that are working with hybrids. You know, there's not much being grown here because this area grew up as a place that could winter over vinifera without, you know, killing them all most winters, basically.
Yep.
So there, you know, it arose as a vinifera area, but obviously I would say it's almost irresponsible to grow vinifera organically here because of the amount of substance that you have to spray them and how often you have to do it and kind of impact that makes on it. And so your point is taken. And I guess that does, you know, I mean, the transition there for me is if we have internal resistance in our grapes, and then it becomes this possibility where we don't have to do the copper, we don't have to do the sulfur sometimes, you know, in certain cases. You know, obviously, like you said, I do agree that there are gray areas and we need to think ecologically about, like, you know, how much I'm spraying and how much diesel fuel I'm using to do that to try to be organic. But I'm also, you know, what I've seen is that can be changed with hybrids, you know, so that it's part of that reason, part of the way that people are stuck in this idea that organics can be difficult in marginal climates is because we're stuck on trying to grow vinifera in them, like vinifera here in the Finger Lakes, vinifera up in Quebec, where I think they're also doing some incredible hybrid wine. And so I guess, I mean, this, you know, I sent you some questions, and if that leads into one of these questions, I think the one that it best leads into is this sort of idea of, like, you know, when I reached out to you, that where, because you know, I should say, for anybody who doesn't know you, you do this weekly roundup of what you've been reading, what you were reading this week, which I love. It keeps me on the pulse of, you know, what's happening out there in the zeitgeist with wine. And you posted Eric Asimov's recent article on hybrid grapes. Can hybrid grapes solve the climate change dilemma for winemakers? And your comment, because you always leave these sort of pithy, sometimes humorous little comments underneath, that your comment for this one was, for some, probably I just wish they tasted better. And right. My experience, though, is that most people have not had that much experience with hybrids, and so it becomes a self-reinforcing situation where, sure, great, yes, like probably what you've had wasn't great, or I believe you, you know, you haven't had things that tasted as good as the vinifera wines you've had. But it's also like, often I find people are sort of, you know, trying to make a comparison between Chinon and Rioja, you know, if I can use a vinifera analogy, you know, where it's like, yeah, I didn't like the Chinon as much as the Rioja, or vice versa, or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but those are just drastically different. You know, they're grown in different ways in different climates. They're different grapes. You know, like, you just can't. It's an apples and oranges comparison, and sure, to make a values judgment about their quality or the, you know, their deliciousness is missing the point.
Fair enough. So, and that's a you know, that's a you know, sort of the, I eschew dogma in that realm as well, which is to say that people are like, well, I just don't like Chardonnay. And then you find them sipping on this great Chablis that they wax, you know, exactly, you know, fantastic about. So, I don't believe in that. Having said that, you know, that wasn't an entirely flip comment, which is to say that, you know, I've been tasting hybrid grapes and American native grape varieties for many, many years. You know, I judged the Colorado wine competition for the last, you know, 10 years running or something like that. And there's a pretty significant portion of hybrid grapes, wines, blends, single varieties made in that competition. You know, I've tasted in the Finger Lakes relatively extensively, tasted a bunch of English still wines, you know, in the early years of English wine, wines from, you know, BC, Vancouver Island, you know, hybrids. So I have that's not an uneducated opinion on my part when it comes to hybrid grapes. You know, but I will also admit that is, you know, sort of, that comment is from the limits of my own experience, and there very well could be hybrid grapes out there that are made in ways that I would absolutely enjoy and champion, and or that will be eventually. And so you won't ever find me saying, "Oh, hybrids, I'm not going to taste them anymore," or declining to taste a glass that somebody's handed me or a bottle that someone sent me, simply because it's hybrid. Like that's not me. That's not what I do. But I have to say that, for all the Saval Blanc and Chambourcin and Frontenac and Marquette and Itasca and Solaris and stuff that I've tasted, none of it has ever rated like particularly highly from my perspective.
Okay. So this leads into the second question of how important do you think that is if we're in a sort of climate emergency? And I mean, I'm going along with taking that as truth, that let's say, I mean, at least for you, you haven't had a comparative experience that met your standards. Even if that was true across the board, which I don't think it is personally, but let's say if that was true across the board for all hybrids, they were subpar in comparison to vinifera. Would it be worth? Are we at a point in time where it's worth making that compromise to get, let's say, 50% more sustainable? And this is a total hypothetical question, of course. But
yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a valuable and an interesting question to ask. And there are two aspects of sustainability that I think are worth looking at in that perspective. The first one, going back to my kind of humanist approach, is if that is what allows you to feed your family and put a roof over your head and, grow a crop in a place where increasingly you are unable to, or you have historically been unable to, good on you, right? Like I am not going to take that away from anybody. I mean, people need to eat, people need to survive, and the magic of being human is the magic of being adaptable. And like, we find these things, and you can farm them, and people will buy them, or you'll make them into products that people will buy. Like that's great. And I think in sustainability conversations, we often like talk about the human part of it last, which I think is a mistake. On the sort of environmental and climate change and climate adaptability side, I think the hybrids and like peewees in particular have a very strong argument going for them. What I don't agree with is that is like the magical solution or the only solution, in the sense that there are an awful lot of other things that can be done. And this is now injecting my point of view as somebody who's a wine critic and a taster. If you can make better wine with vinifera, but a different vinifera, then that I think is the first choice, right? And
why?
If you can make better wine, then I think that's always something to strive for, right?
So it's still assuming the superiority in flavor is what.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
If there's a trick to that, of course, right? Which I'm sure if you're not going to point out directly, it's worth pulling out as an implicit conversation. And what we're having is that the only way that hybrids are going to get better is if people use them and more people use them, and there's time and energy spent in figuring out how to make them into great wines.
Right.
So I'm supportive of people doing that, but as somebody who tastes very, very widely and across the world of wine, like I'm still waiting for the great stuff to emerge. And so the conversation about how to be better for the planet, I think there are a lot of levers to pull. There are a lot of things to work on, whether that's moving towards more regenerative organic and mycorrhizal supportive, farming methods, whether that's things like you're experimenting with in terms of agroforestry, whether that's, biodynamic, if that's the way you want to go, no-till agriculture, I think, is really quite interesting. Although, again, one of those things that in certain places in the world, just you can't do, right? I mean, it's very, very difficult to practice that way in certain places in the world. But I think absolutely worth doing if you can. To lock carbon into the soil and not kill the mycorrhizal kingdom, and so I think there's a lot of stuff to do from a sustainability standpoint before, or maybe in addition, right, to the idea of switching away from a grape variety that for thousands of years has been perfected in collaboration with the human species and is capable of producing so much magic in the world. Well, let me say one other thing too,
Yeah,
which
please.
is that one of the other things that is important to recognize is that this also doesn't have to be an either or conversation, right? Which is to say
Oh,
that,
absolutely. Yeah.
maybe what we really need to do is we really need to get people putting 10% Chambourcin in their Syrahs, right? Or, blending in a little bit of that, Maréchal Foch into your Cabernet Franc or whatever, right? Like, so
Right.
this can happen in degrees, and so I'm not averse to that kind of experimentation at all.
Yeah, no, these are all great points. Yeah, I mean, I definitely say that when I talk to growers in California, which is like, do a trial,
Mm-hmm.
consider, yeah, just like try a block,
Yep.
um I mean, and then yeah, like that's kind of how California wine was back in the day. You'd do a lot of blending. I mean, there were hybrids in California back in the day, and a lot of times they went into the blends. I mean, as there were everywhere, as
Sure.
like France had way more hybrids.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's far too little experimentation in the world of wine. And the more settled and hidebound appellation you are in the world, the less there is. And I think that's ultimately a mistake. And I think that's why you're seeing these vin de France sort of crises and people breaking away. And there's for all the value that things like appellations and the classification of wines and stuff like that have brought to the industry over the years, there's an awful lot of rigidity that's been built up, and a lot of opportunities that have been closed off because of it. So
Yeah, that rigidity is something that I push against a lot, and part of what I feel, I think, yeah, what I take on a lot is just the idea, whether, I mean, you sound very open-minded, and yet I'd say that the wine culture that you operate in most, I mean, that is the dominant wine culture, is, I characterize it as vinifera culture, which is not
sure.
to blame vinifera, but is this idea that where we are is somehow like a pinnacle. And I mean, you echoed that to a certain point, that like thousands of years of human cultivation of this species of grape, um, which is all true. I'm not taking anything away from that. And I love vinifera, like you said, it's not an either or, it's a both and. And so I just find myself more in the position of trying to create space for something that has been excluded. And it's like anything. It's like you can critique something as being less than, without understanding that part of the reason it's less than is a self-reinforcing prophecy, in that you never give it the resources, the time, the care, the kind of winemaking, the kind of land, and everything needed
Yeah.
to make it's what it can be.
Yeah. But it's
And
a bit like, I mean, it's a bit like fringe art or fringe music, right? Like, go back to the early days of punk, right? Like, where, if you were in a punk band, it was hard to get a booking someplace. And a lot of people just thought the music was trash and, whatever. And that's the lot of any sort of emerging, set of ideas or discourses, which is that
So
it has
the
something to prove.
the difference, though, is that I think prejudice has been deeply embedded, and there, I mean, hybrids were made illegal in the EU. I mean, that's a slightly different thing. Punk was never made illegal. I mean, maybe punk shows were made illegal in some places, but like, you get my point. It's I mean, when you have, when you make a genetic line, when you draw a genetic line, and it's about purity. First of all, there's something creepy about that to me. Again, that the thing that you're talking about being, we've been sort of stuck. We're kind of, we've been a little, yeah, we're a little rigid. I mean, I think it's beyond that. I think there's like a chauvinism to this culture that is
Yeah,
vinifera culture, that is
I,
the
th- I think
dominant
that's
wine culture.
true, but I mean that's the way the mainstream looks to any fringe conversation always,
I
right?
mean, that's
Like,
true. That's definitely true.
right? So the mainstream is always kind of locked into its status quo and slow to change and slow to emerge. But eventually you get the police, which are the breakthrough, and I'm talking out of school here because I'm not a music historian or even
Me
really
either. So
a true
you can
music
say
fan.
anything. Yeah.
But using them as an example, right, in this model of punk, is sort of like at the beginning they were like, whoa, these people, they're freakazoids, and then eventually people are like, wow, this is really good music, and now they're very much part of sort of the mainstream rock canon. And some people, right, would argue, oh, well, that's because they lost the edge and they went more mainstream, and that's a separate conversation, right?
Right.
But I think that it's always a fight, right? It's always a fight against the status quo in just about anything, because that's the way that humans work. That's the way our
Yeah.
brains work. We fear change fundamentally. And evolution has taught us to do that. And there's very good reasons for that. Does that mean that we close ourselves off to possibilities that might make our lives better? All the time, in every walk of life. And so, yeah, I mean, if for those who believe that hybrids are the future and that there's great value there, then that is absolutely a fight worth fighting, right? But at the same time, to flip the hat and to speak from the mainstream, like, well, you also got to prove yourself, right? Like, if you say that this is the future and stuff like that, what you have to be able to prove to somebody who's steeped in the culture of traditional wine, that those grapes can make wines that are as profound and as compelling and as exciting as the wines that are quote unquote part of the sort of the sensibilities of what makes a fantastic wine in the mainstream of the discourse.
Yeah. Those are great points. I guess the argument that I would make is that even if let's agree, or let's like let's whatever agree to disagree about the flavor of hybrids, or just concede that they have a long way to go. um I still think that hybridization is the future. So whether
Mm-hmm.
our current hybrids are what we will be drinking in 50 years, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. There's a really strong argument that they won't be. But will we be drinking hybrids? I mean, I think if we want to have a future in wine, we have to. I mean, I think part of the evolution, the adaptation of vinifera for thousands of years was just the chance of geography. There was only a single species of grape in the Fertile Crescent that existed, and so they didn't have other species to cross with, and so that's what they had. That's what they had to work with. But now that we're in a global world where we know there's 80 species of grapes on Earth, and they all can contribute to what wine can be, it seems really short-sighted of us to think we've achieved the best that wine can be with Cabernet. You know what I mean? And that, or Pinot and Chardonnay, the seven grapes that are globally planted on every
Well,
continent, and
yeah, I
that
mean, Don't
And
get me started. Don't get me started about the 7 grapes, because, absolutely, you heard me lead off my wine philosophy with like diversity and curiosity. Like, life is
right,
too
right.
short to be drinking Turkish freaking Merlot, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
come on,
right.
so there's definitely way too narrow-minded to focus on just a few grape varieties, for sure, irrespective of how I might react to the first part of that statement. I want to just make it clear. Yeah,
Right.
for God's sake, we don't need more Chardonnay in the world. Like, give me some Kalechi Karasu, give me some, Listan Blanco. There's so many amazing grape varieties in the world, to drink and to enjoy. Just life's too short to drink just the same shit every day.
So that maybe a way we can turn then is as to the subjectivity of taste.
Okay.
Maybe some of our differences would have to do with the fact that, like, you might taste something and I might taste the same thing, and we might disagree about that. Or
Well, I mean, the existence of the natural wine movement, and its incredible popularity these days, certainly speaks to that, right? I mean, I go into some natural wine bars and try a lot of things, and I'm like, all of these wines are undrinkable. Yet there are, people packed to the gills, I won't use derogatory words, but like drinking this stuff like it's the greatest thing on earth. And I'm like, if I want kombucha, I drink kombucha. Like, I don't want wine that tastes like that. Thank you very much.
I
And
just I want to make a point in defense of Usonia that this wine is not like that. This is a clean, beautiful wine. It's 0-0, and it is,
right,
honestly, I'm surprised how good it is, especially a week open in the fridge.
excellent.
Anyway, just
Incidentally, they make vinifera too, do they not?
yeah, they work. I think they're trying. Yeah, they're working with what they can work with. Like I said, there just isn't a lot of hybrids grown here. I mean, and most of them are grown for Welch's, if there are hybrids. They're just,
Sure.
or they're grown for like Taylors.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Or Manischewitz or whatever.
that's the history of that part of the world, for sure.
Right,
Right.
right. So yeah, so I mean, for people who are trying to get quality wine grapes who are grown in a way where you get, where you can produce, a beautiful wine, it is there's like 3 vineyards, here.
Yeah.
And then if you want them to be organic, maybe you're down to 1 vineyard, or 2.
Yes.
So even harder. And I think that's what they're focusing on is, people that are farming really well, as well as possible, given whatever the limits, like you said, that they have to deal with.
For sure. But back
So
to this idea of subjectivity of taste, right? Like,
please, yes,
that's absolutely true, right?
right,
The appreciation of wine is as subjective as the appreciation of music or art, in every way. And there's also like a canon of of that discourse that is well established, and standards that have been benchmarks that have been created over the years that can and do guide the art and discourse of appreciation of that particular domain, right? So um, like a classic thing, is sort of like the Salieri Mozart conversation, right? It's sort of a person whose opinions I didn't always appreciate, and whose personality I didn't always appreciate online. In the early days of internet wine and food forums, had a signature line under every post that he made, which said, "It's okay to like Salieri. It's not okay to think that he's better than Mozart." Um, which, as much as I didn't particularly appreciate this guy, is 100% true, right? Like, the massive opinion about classical music in the world, gone through many generations of appreciation, makes it clear that Mozart is without a doubt a better musician than Salieri. Um, uh, but that doesn't mean that you can't like Salieri more than Mozart. That's just fine. But you can't also then have a conversation where you're like, "Oh, you people are stupid," right? Like, you know what you're talking about. Salieri is the best. I mean, you can say that, sure, but you also can't then react poorly when everyone laughs at your face.
So,
And I think
yes.
that's true of wine as well, which is to say that you can like the mousy, hazy, funky bottle just as much as you want,
Right.
but you can't then turn around and tell, people like me that, oh, well, but all you like is industrial poison.
Oh yeah, no. And I think you and I think you and I agree fully on that. I'm but then let's take it a little more nuanced and like great. Yes, there are I think we totally agree on that. More like if I can use the dreaded foxy term,
Hmm.
which I did a whole episode about, and have done a deep dive into what that term came from, what it means, what it actually tastes like in a wine, and so as it turns out, it is a flavor that much of the world loves. So like the most planted grape in the world, has the flavors that we refer to as, or not we, but some people have referred to as foxy. That Concord grape, Welch's grapiness, like or what can be sort of strawberry candy like flavors. Um, there's maybe the bigger question here is there a snobbery in thinking that these tastes that are appealing clearly to masses of people, to like the global majority, I would argue, um, are considered to be less than, considered to be inferior tastes, uneducated tastes by what I would call vinifera culture again.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. Like, people like the grape juice, but they want different things from wine than they want from grape juice. So, like, the most popular hamburger in the world is McDonald's, but that doesn't mean that it's good, that it's good for you, that it's good for the environment, that it's good food. But people all around the world flock to and spend money buying McDonald's hamburgers
So, but in
because
this,
they like that taste. Now, you and I should then have a conversation around, like, okay, well, grass-fed, organic beef, cooked,
right?
not to oblivion, with amazing toppings and stuff like that, is fundamentally a superior hamburger.
Yeah.
And that, like, people can say, oh, I prefer McDonald's. Great. I don't recommend that. You're going to kill yourself eating that way. But if you like that better, then absolutely don't spend $25, on a hamburger at, Bourbon Steak, in restaurant. Go get your Big Mac. But if you appreciate fine food and excellent ingredients and things like that, you can't look at a McDonald's hamburger and say, well, just because it's popular, there's something there.
How do we know which wine is McDonald's in this case? Like, I guess that would be the way I would sort of question that analogy.
Yeah, I mean,
You know,
like all analogies, it doesn't, it can't be carried too far. But I'm mostly responding to this idea of, like, well, everybody likes the flavors of these grapes, and
right,
they drink
right,
their
right.
Welch's grape juice, and I'm like, yeah, well, but that's kind of the equivalent of the McDonald's hamburger. If you want to translate that to the world of wine, I would say it's the Barefoots of the world, right? It's the things that come in wine bottles but are really beverages, not wine, right? That
Right.
are made
Yeah.
in massive industrial scale with
Agreed.
tons of
Agreed.
additives,
Yeah.
that show no artisanship, no terroir, etc. Right? And
Right.
there are hundreds of thousands of people where that is their experience of wine. And so while I can sit here and say that's bad wine, I also can't condemn those people for drinking that stuff. And for every barefoot wine drinker, there's another one that started that way and is now drinking, $30 Sonoma Coast, Pinot Noir, or much finer things. I mean, I've watched my dad go through that progression. I've watched, an endless number of my friends, some with my coaching, some without, move from buying, the $12 wines in the supermarket to, oh my God, I just got on the William Sellium, mailing list, or like, oh, have you had this, incredible stuff? And, now they're wine geeks, and it's great. It brings such joy to me to see that. So there's a place in the world for that stuff. And all of us in the wine world would do well to remember that 95% of the people in the world experience wine that way and those wines.
Yeah, I would say that analogy, or that what you're saying, also applies regardless of the species of the variety or the multi-species of the variety. So it's more about a quality wine rather than specific flavors of grapes or specific, speciation of grapes. If that makes sense. Do you know what I'm
Yeah, I
saying?
mean, the first time I have a Solaris wine that knocks my socks off, you can bet I'm going to be writing about how awesome it is, completely irrespective of what grape it's made from.
I'm shocked you haven't had one.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say the Pewees I've had a lot fewer of than the traditional vinifera, rupestris or lambrusca hybrids,
Hmm.
or the native hybrids. So I have a lot of catching up to do in the Pewee space, in terms of tasting, and so I'm always on the hunt for opportunities to do that. And it sounds like we might get that if you're with this seminar you're going to run it at
Yeah,
Davis
yeah.
here.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for you to come. Have you had Adam Tolmac's hybrids that are out of Ojai? His
No, I have
state
not
red or
had.
state white.
I have not had those. I think pretty highly of Adam, so I'd be quite
I
curious to
mean,
try them.
definitely check them out. I mean, I say this with all respect to Adam because all of his wines are fantastic, but those two were my favorites. And clearly, I'm biased, but the people I was with are not biased. They were just friends who are not, like me. I have no chip on their shoulder about hybrids, and they actually appreciated them as
Great.
well. Now, having said that, they're bred to be 97% vinifera. So they're, I wouldn't say they are representative of the mass majority of hybrids out there. But just as there they are. It's
Yep.
one end of the spectrum of what is possible with hybrids, and I guess that's
Yeah.
kind of my point, is that it's hard to generalize about these things because
Where do you
they are.
sit on the genetically modified conversation?
I think there's so much great traditional breeding, like, especially if anybody is listening and doesn't know, most hybrids happen from just pollination, like somebody's taking pollen from one grape species or multi-species and adding it to another, and letting the grapes grow, and that kind of thing. And there are so many people doing that, private breeders, institutional breeders all around the world. I think we just need to incentivize more of that. I mean, for the last century, we've incentivized, external resilience by incentivizing the production of, fossil fuel based pesticides. This is where we've gotten our resilience from for the past century. And if we'd instead incentivize, or not even century, the last 80 years, if we'd instead incentivized more grape breeding, like, we would have probably some of these problems solved, where we'd have a much wider array of hybrids that taste delicious for people to have a better example of what's out there, what's possible. Instead, we invest all that time and resources into chemistry, and
Mhm.
we have the wine culture that we have now, which is propped up on chemical crutches for the most part around the world. And I would say we don't need to, I don't think we need to speed up the process. I think we just need to, like, double down on our investment in traditional breeding. And,
But
you
what
know,
if we? But what if
phil-
we just
philosophically,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, philosophically, I'm just, it, I'm not a huge fan of genetic modification in general.
Mhm.
I feel like letting natural processes lead, is our probably our best hope, because our ego isn't coming into play in that sense. I mean, it is, but we're shepherding a process rather than leading it.
Yeah.
And if that makes sense, I don't know. There's a subtle difference there. We're providing the circumstances for natural processes to, or for just plants to do their own decision making, so to speak,
Uh-huh.
within the realm of their environmental conditions and genetics, versus saying we want this, therefore we're going to create it, using our big brains and technology, without understanding what those consequences might be genetically or environmentally. And yeah, so I mean, look, accidents could happen in traditional breeding as well, like accidents or whatever. I mean, there's no accidents, but you know what I mean. Like consequences that would be unfavorable to our ends could happen on either side
Mhm.
of the spectrum. But I don't know. I feel better about letting the plants decide. I guess is
Yeah.
how I feel about that.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know. In my sort of like lack of or deliberate lack of dogma, I think it's an interesting question because on the one hand, sure, like putting frog genes into grapes, like, yeah, way across the line, like nobody
right, right.
wants those kinds of things. But like if we through our genetic analysis manage to figure out that, oh, there is one gene in this grape that makes it susceptible to downy mildew, and if you just flip that switch, all of a sudden this grape isn't anymore, um, is certainly more interventionalist than the 20 generations that it might take you in your cross pollination in a greenhouse to get that result. But at the end, it's sort of the same result, right? I mean, like we have done such things through traditional crossing and pollination based grape stuff, for thousands of years as human beings. And so, I think there's quite a gray spectrum between this world of hybrids and GMO, and unfortunately, there's just all this baggage with GMO,
Well,
that
I have a
that
better answer for you, if I
okay.
can. I think now, as you're saying this, I'm realizing probably what I want to say is the reason right now that we're using GMOs is to preserve vinifera culture. So I have a problem with that philosophically. I have a problem with saying we want genetic purity and of our vinifera, and all we want from these other grapes is this one gene, or these this little polygenetic allele that gives us powdery and downy resistance. I think
But
if we're gonna,
isn't that what you're drinking at the moment? Like, isn't that grape that you're drinking at the moment the result of that?
it possibly, I don't know, it's Steuben. It was one of the old,
Oh,
it's a pretty heavily Labrusca crossed thing.
oh, okay, all right. Sorry, I
So
thought you were drinking a Peewee.
no, it's a Steuben. So I mean, sure that yes, I mean, I still concede it probably is. I mean, I think that hybrids were seen as the solution to vinifera's problems from day one. It was like phylloxera, black rot, downy mildew, powdery mildew that had all been brought over to Europe by Europeans and European Americans who were, because of globalization. And we were like, oops, we fucked up. Let's solve those problems by
Hmm.
introducing some more resilient genetics from North America. I think that's a limiting idea. I don't see hybrids as that. I think I see hybridization as the inevitable adaptation of wine as we move forward, and it will stop being a tool to preserve vinifera culture and start being the generation of every new grape. It will become how we make grapes. We're just looking for interesting new things. Like, let's roll the dice and see when we come up with how we come up with what we come up with, and we might end up with some really beautiful new things that we'd never considered, and also have resistance and all the things that we want in terms of resilience as we adapt into the future. And just so, in other words, stopping to see hybrids as tools and starting to see them, value them in and of themselves as grapes in the same way that we value all grapes. They're just grapes, rather than a genetic solution to vinifera's lack of resilience. So
Yeah, I don't have anything contrary to say to that point of view, in the sense that that's a totally valid approach, and who knows, you may be right. Um, uh, so keep with that crossing, everybody.
um I want to ask you. You are, you kind of have your finger on the pulse of many things. You started by saying how you were part of this big change in wine, and I think now we might be undergoing an even bigger change in wine. I'm curious what your thoughts are about where we are.
Yeah, we are definitely in the midst of change, without a doubt.
I mean,
I
not
think
just in
it's
wine, really.
I think it's change across a number of different factors. I think consumption habits are going through a generational change, and um, they always do. Uh, and this one happens to be very much against the grain of traditional wine culture. People are drinking less alcohol. People are choosing other options like THC, infused beverages, or
Yeah.
um, ready to drinks and things like that. And it is a fundamental change, and the question is, will it change back at some point? And how long this change is going to impact the market. But without a doubt, consumption's dropping everywhere. Um, and what that means is that there are too many vines in the ground, too many brands in the marketplace, and too much wine being made by those brands. And so we're seeing a market correction. And unfortunately, wineries are going to go out of business. Vines are going to get yanked up out of the ground. Distributors are going to go out of business. Retailers are going to go out of business. People are going to have to start making less wine because they can't sell this stuff that they're making. And eventually, because markets do this, it will sort itself out. But there's probably going to be a lot of pain along the way. And that's unfortunate as somebody who wants to see the wine industry flourish and succeed. But I think it's just the nature of reality. I mean, there's no magic wand to wave to fix this. There's no, there's nothing to do. Having said that, um, I think wine has historically been very, very bad about building its own market and customer base. And so, you see a lot of conversations these days, which I think have, more than a grain of truth to them, which is to say that, wine just hasn't ever bothered to try and appeal to younger generations in the way that it needs to. And many of the values that have been traditional in the wine world are not the values shared by this younger generation, and so that's why they're not drinking wine. That's why they're out, drinking, cocktails in a can, or things like that. And so I think there's a lot of work that the wine industry has to do there. Um, and I think obviously there's crazy climate chaos around the world, and like anti-alcohol movements that are kind of really scary neo-prohibitionist, sort of like weird things going on where people believe that alcohol is the devil and needs to go away. And that isn't help. Neither of those things are helping either, right? I mean, it'd be bad enough if we were just seeing a big generational change in consumption and nothing else was wrong with the wine industry. But people are
Right.
are battling for their livelihood on a number of different fronts. Whether it's worrying about whether your vineyard is going to burn down, or the fact that you can't get enough water in your vineyard to grow the grapes that you've and your family have historically grown for generations, or the fact that your country is basically saying, yeah, we're going to just shut down all advertising and marketing associated with alcohol, and we're going to crank up the drunk driving limit so that anybody with a whisper of alcohol in their breath can't drive at all, right? I mean, there's some pretty crazy external factors that are
Right.
not helping the situation.
Yeah. What inspires you? And if I can frame that question, you, in your recent roundup of articles that you've been reading, this was something I mentioned to you, was you had this link to a great article about wine in Wales right now, and
Mm.
your comment was definitely some inspiration to be had here. There was a great quote from, it included a conversation with Valentine Blattner, or not necessarily, sort of some of his perspectives. in relation to that, I mean, I could read this thing from that article, but I'll just say, you know, I use that as a framing device to say, did you get any inspiration from that article? If so, what, and what otherwise, what inspires you right now?
Yeah, so I mean, what was partially inspirational to me from that article was a lot of the kind of like agroforestry, regenerational farming, sort of zero interventionalist farming, biodiversity stuff that he was doing. More so than the fact that he happens to be doing that with hybrid grapes. Um,
Right.
but uh, but yeah,
You're
I mean,
talking,
I find it inspiring in general in the world of wine, as people kind of like push the frontiers and the boundaries of what's possible, and that can come in the form of making wine in a place that nobody thought was possible before. That can come from reviving ancient grape varieties that are close to dead, but that were part of the region's culture and history for hundreds or thousands of years. I'm inspired by people who have incredible passion for what they do, regardless of what they're farming and where. And ultimately, I'm inspired by amazing wine that when I put it in my mouth and I'm like, oh my god, this is incredible. So sometimes you find all those things in one place, and then it's like, oh my god, this is amazing. Look at this guy up in the Savoie region of France who's like, doesn't trim his vines, and is planting thousands of trees in amongst the rows, and it's like blah blah blah. And sometimes you find one or two of those things in one place.
yeah, I should mention. Well, I don't know if you were talking about Paul and Gemma at Hebron with their sort of arbustrum on willows, that they were part of that article. But I feel like you and I should have had this whole conversation about agroforestry. It sounds like we share some fascination with that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, I think it's the idea that that's kind of the native environment for vines in nature is pretty interesting. I think
Yeah,
it can be a particularly compelling argument from a mycorrhizal standpoint.
yeah, yeah.
And then I think the idea that fuck, vineyards just need more shade than they're getting, historically, and why not do that with something that's beautiful and might help, with the sort of the microecology of that particular place. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting, and I'm also fascinated with things like the wines of Jardin Occulto and
Yeah.
the Cinti Valley tradition of growing old mission grapes, in the trees there for hundreds of years, and some of those vines are just incredibly old and crazy. So I think there's something there. I don't see it as a silver bullet by any means, or maybe even appropriate for every situation. But I'm fascinated by the sort of the experimentation that people are doing, and of course as you know, there's a great long history there, right? I mean, I was
Right.
so super psyched to go with uh, with Giampiero Bea out to see the Vini Maritata vines in Umbria that he
Mm.
uses to make his arboreus wine.
How
And
are they trellised? I mean, how not trell? I mean, obviously they're trellised on trees, but how do they?
They so the Vini Maritata in Umbria and in much of that central section of central Italy is about stringing long vines between trees and above cereal crops. So
And
you
are the
basically
trees pollarded? Are they sort of chopped off at like a certain height and then allowed to just have a little afro of
I don't
growth?
think so. No, they're
Oh,
they're
okay.
just they're just sort of normal trees, and about 5-6 feet up the trunk, the vine branches off, and you have these sort of long hanging, sort of loops of vines between the trees that can be 10, 20, sometimes even 30 feet apart, right?
And
So you've got this.
are they using like string or anything to
I don't
support
know
that?
how they train them originally. If you go and look at my article on Palo Bea, I've got pictures of that particular vineyard where he's got the Trebbiano growing that way. And yeah, they are at the moment they're self-supported, but those are 80, 90-year-old vines, 100-something-year-old vines. So it's
Right.
unclear what was required at any point, to get them to that place, right?
Right.
Whether you
Right.
put stakes or strings or what have you. But at the moment, it's just these sort of like these vines doing these kind of loop-de-loops between the, not loop-de-loops, but these sort of like little
Festoons, right?
parabolic
Yeah.
little hanging arches between these trees, over
Right.
which and under which there would be row crops and cereal crops.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I don't know if you know, but I'm doing a Vita Maritata here in New
Yes.
York. That's the whole point of what I'm doing. That's
And
one
that
of
that started that started this May.
I started planting in April. Yeah, May,
Yeah.
April. Yeah, and maybe it was May. I got here in April. I probably started planting in May. But yeah, and trying multiple different things. So the arbustrum there, that Hebron is reviving in Wales. That thing that you're describing with the sort of vines festooned between trees, as these big sort of garlands, that sort of
Yeah.
string across the land. And then another, which will be just, you know, letting a tree and a vine grow together, just
Yeah.
let them do their thing, sort of like a vineyard orchard vibe where they
Yeah.
just grow fully expressed, both of them, just, trained and pruned to not, outcompete each other, basically.
Yeah. The stuff
Um,
like you're seeing in Chile and in Bolivia and stuff like that.
yeah, those are really, I mean, which, right, just came out of necessity, because it was like they're in a remote valley in the middle of Bolivia without, what are you going to do, buy, wires and stuff and truck
Sure.
them in to, like,
Or sometimes accident, right? Like, I don't know if you've had the País Sauvage from Bouchon in Chile, but found wild they found pais growing wild in a gully near the vineyard, and they just
oh,
decided to start harvesting it. And so now they make a wine every year. They make a couple of wines now, because they also had a weird uh, mutant white cultivar version pop up, and so they
oh,
make
that's great.
a white pais and a red pais. But that's that they're just totally picked from these trees that they've all grown into, which was probably a result of birds eating the grapes and then pooping in this little gully where there are all these
Exactly, yeah.
trees. And interestingly, if you drive around Maule and Itata in the fall, you sort of you see all these grapevines in the turning yellow in amongst the trees, and it's the country is just riddled with grapes through the forests there.
Right, yeah. We have a little bit of that in Southern California, actually, where the old, the old mission vineyards that were just abandoned for 80 years went to seed, did a thing, and now there's vines growing amongst the old vines that were planted that don't look like those old vines. There's the clearly, like, the ones that were planted, and then there's the seedling ones that are white, or pink, or they're a whole different,
Yeah.
whatever mutation of the original thing, because they just were seeds dropped into the dirt
Yeah.
by the vines or by birds who ate the vines.
Yeah.
So
Don't tell Randall Graham, otherwise he'll start making another wine.
yeah, no, we've got people doing it. Randall's got his hands full, I think.
He really does have his hands full with Poblacium for sure. But it's I think it's fascinating, right? I mean, I was just presenting a panel at the Chenin Blanc celebration in the Loire, and the panel that I was on was sharing a bunch of research by Dr. Patrice Thies, who did all this research into the epigenetic drift of Chenin Blanc clones in South Africa, and how quite clearly we know some of the clones that were brought down there, in the 1600s and 1700s, and even 1800s, and if we now look at those grapes, the vines propagated from those clones uh, in South Africa, and compare them to the genetics of those same clones in France, they're totally different, right?
Amazing.
For all
Yeah.
intents and purposes, they might well be, entirely different clones at this point, considered different clones at this point, and that's just purely due to the adaptation of that vine to that environment. And so it's that's one of the reasons I get pretty excited about old vines, and I do all the work that I do with the Old Vine Registry, is because it's that kind of sort of genetic adaptation and diversity that old vines give us access to, that many people don't realize.
Can you give a little plug for that? Because
Sure.
yeah.
So I about 13, 14 years ago, Jancis Robinson and one of her colleagues, Tam Curran, decided that just on a whim they would start keeping track of all the old vineyards that they ran across in their work as wine critics and journalists. And so they just started building a spreadsheet. And after a couple of years, they had a few hundred entries, and so they decided to start making that spreadsheet available to anybody who wanted it, just kind of as like an open source knowledge sharing thing. And over the course of 12 years or so, that grew to about 1,800 lines of data. And at a certain point, it became kind of unwieldy, and Jancis sort of put out a public call saying, "Hey, this really deserves to be like a database, that people could to make better use of it. Is there anybody that'd be willing to help us do that?" And I raised my hand and said yes. And so we raised some money, and then I sort of architected and designed and built this website called the Old Vine Registry. And we're now up to 7,000, almost 7,005, no, 7,800 individual vineyards and plots listed in there. We're attempting to essentially catalog the world of old vines around the world, anything older than 35 years. And with the idea that you can't preserve what you don't know about. And, once we start to get, a really substantial body of information there, it can start to become a useful source for the industry and for academia, and ideally, drive more interest in sales of old vine wines, which is really what is going to ultimately keep those vines in the ground. So, on a day-to-day basis, I run and manage that website, and love all things old vines.
I love that. What is the oldest vineyard in the world?
So there are some individual vines in places
Right.
that we
Southern
know
California.
are several hundred years old. And so some of
Are
those,
you looking at all vines? Like, are you looking at the muscadine on the North Carolina coast that's like over 400
yes,
years old? Okay, beautiful.
yes,
Okay,
right. So some of those like truly historic vines, the mother vine in North Carolina, for instance, that's we say is at least 300 years old. The current leader of that is something called the Old Vine of von Rachnitz,
right.
in the Nahe region of Germany, which people believe was planted around 1423.
Wow.
There's something called the Old Vine House in Maribor, Slovenia,
Yeah.
where there's this vine that's sort of grown up and around this house and now takes up, like a portion of a hectare, that we believe is something like 400 something years old.
Right.
There's another, I think the oldest true vineyard that has like multiple vines is the Rosengarten vineyard in the Pfalz region of Germany, which people believe is about 400 years old. But
Jeez.
there's also a bunch of stuff in Georgia that is like not well cataloged, and potentially some stuff in Iran as well,
Oh yeah.
and Armenia that really we don't really know about, that I'm sure is gonna push those
Oh
ages.
yeah. Amazing. Have you seen? What do you know about the Vigna Madre, or the Mother Vine in San Gabriel Mission in Los Angeles?
Uh so that I think is more on the order of like a couple hundred years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't
It's the
know
West
much.
Coast Old Vine,
West
basically.
West Coast Old Line. There you go. Uh, and Yeah, I don't know a ton about it. I know somebody. I think is it. God, who is it that's making wine from it each year?
There's the Los Angeles. What are they called? The yeah. Them.
The
Yeah,
Alder
yeah.
River Wine Company that I think it's called or something like that.
Well,
But
there's Angelino, but also I think Byron Blatty and Cavaletti are part of that. But maybe it's just
got it.
Angelino. I don't know. I think it's
Yeah.
I think it's they're called like Los Angeles Vintners
Hmm.
Association, and I think they all get together. I could be wrong. It might just be down to Angelino at this point.
Yeah.
LA is my home base as well, so little connection there. Yeah, it's I brought some of the cuttings from that vine here to New York, and
Oh, interesting.
surprisingly, they're doing okay. It's
Got
like,
it. So Pais in the Finger Lakes, huh?
yeah, Pais crossed with Vitis Gurdiana, because it's actually turns out to be a hybrid that
Oh,
vine.
interesting.
Yeah, it's a
Huh.
50-50. Yeah, the Southern California native species crossed with Mission. Yeah,
Huh.
Mission. Yeah. Um. Well, shoot. Anything else? Anything that you would like to promote or say, or any final words?
Oh, I don't really have anything to promote, but I've enjoyed the conversation and can't wait to get the Adam Huss personal guided tour of a bunch of hybrid grapes at some point here in the future.
Well, Alder, I really appreciate you doing this. I mean, I reached out to you out of the blue. I sent you, questions that were clearly challenging questions, and you were game from the beginning, and I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. Thank you so
Huh.
much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Okay, here's the epilogue that I mentioned in the intro. That is an email exchange between Alder and I. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I will just jump right in. Hi, Alder. As I'm producing and preparing an introduction for your episode, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to one point that I want to make, if you'd like. Unfortunately, it was a point that I didn't specifically respond to, as it was at that one moment where I lost my train of thought while thinking ahead or due to ADD. I had posed the theoretical question of, essentially, wouldn't it be worth incorporating hybrids into our wine, even if they didn't taste as good as vinifera, if they provided 50% more resilience? Your response was that you think there are lots of other options to try as well, and let's not abandon pure vinifera cultivars that have been quote-unquote perfected over the last few thousand years. What I plan to say is something along the lines of, I disagree with this idea that vinifera has been quote-unquote perfected, or even that humans were aiming for perfection. I would agree that humans have made continual efforts to quote-unquote improve these vines, but I don't think the goal of the humans who domesticated and grew and selected and crossed vinifera was perfection. I think they were just trying to adapt, and I think they'd have engaged in the same process the dominant wine culture now resists, the process of hybridization, if they had multiple species of grapes to work with. I think we look at wine now from a glass-down perspective. Vinifera culture is built on a selection of grapes based on the perception of the quote-unquote perfect flavors. But if you are a farmer, I think you look at wine crops a bit differently. You want resilience. You want the maximal output for minimal input. Yes, you do want that output to be delicious, but you also care about the health and productive vitality of your vines and land. And you will make choices informed by both values weighed simultaneously. You aren't married to flavors as a farmer. You're looking for flavors married to easier, less risky, and healthier farming. When you combine these values, you become open to change and adaptation if it brings more of both flavor and resilience. In other words, my problem isn't with vinifera, it's with looking at wine without the context of farming. For the past 80 years or so, the dominant wine culture stopped caring about that second value of health and vitality in our vines and land and actually sacrificed it in service of the value of a subjective judgment of deliciousness. Yes, the use of the word perfected may be semantic, but I think it's worth pointing out that this idea haunts our discussion of vinifera versus hybrids, and I think it's a blatantly false presumption if we take into account more than just flavor. If vinifera had been perfected, it wouldn't need to be sprayed so much. For us to say it has been perfected over the last few thousand years is to ignore one really big area where it hasn't been improved at all in the last 150 years, with quite negative results. We may just disagree about this, as we discussed at the beginning of the conversation. You're open to drinking/promoting delicious wine grown with conventional pesticides, while I am not. I think ecological considerations have to be part of what guides our evaluation of wine. But since I didn't say this bit above while we were talking, I wanted to give you a chance to respond, and I'll be happy to include your response if you'd like. Thanks again, Adam. Alder's response. Adam, one of the things your argument glosses over is the fact that the sprays that we both agree are bad have only existed for 80 years. But we've been growing vinifera for 7,200 years or so before that without chemical inputs. There's always a lot of baggage around the word quote-unquote perfected, of course, and I certainly wouldn't be in the position of arguing that the current state of vinifera wine growing culture is perfect. But it does represent, as I've noted, thousands of years of collaboration between our species, from which we have yielded more than 10,000 distinct grape varieties that serve our myriad purposes as human beings. And these purposes go far beyond yield, extending into meaning within local food cultures, familial traditions, religious and political currents, commerce and trade, and at the root of all those things, I believe, flavor. Deliciousness drove vinifera culture for thousands of years before the invention of synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. So I don't think it's fair to imply that somehow, quote, the subjective judgment of deliciousness has overridden sensibility to the health and vitality of vines and land. Humans are lazy and always want shortcuts to make our lives easier. That's what chemical inputs promised us and, in fact, deliver. We're now reaping what we sowed in that realm, and I'm pleased to see so many producers around the world deciding to trade more effort and uncertainty on their part for healthier plants, healthier soils, and healthier humans working the land. You suggest wine is looked at from a glass-down perspective, but ever since we started growing grapes for wine instead of eating them, we've looked at wine that way. What's in the glass is the synthesis and fullest expression of everything that the wine grower does, and for thousands of years, the decisions made in the farming and, yes, vine breeding have been aimed at the quality of the ultimate product. In the face of climate change, does every wine region need to look at the grapes they are working with and consider whether there's something better to plant? Absolutely. Can and should hybrids be considered? Absolutely. But you're not going to get a farming culture that for thousands of years has been focused on quality based in flavor to abandon that core tenet of wine growing. No matter how much, quote, better they are for the planet, according to their proponents, hybrids are, quite rightly in my mind, going to be held to the standards that wine grapes have been held to since time immemorial. Do they make wine that people believe is superior? Full stop. And since, in my experience, and I might add the experience of the majority of the critical establishment, they are not yet delivering the kind of quality and flavors that vinifera are capable of, I'm not ready to, quote, ditch vinifera, when there are plenty of other effective and worthy efforts focused on climate resiliency, soil health, and environmental protections to be undertaken. As you noted, I'm open to tasting any wine from anywhere grown with any kind of grape, and I heartily encourage anyone and everyone to put in the time and energy and effort to explore the possibilities of hybrid grapes because they have many salient and useful qualities. But deliciousness is always going to be the final test, and in the ages-long discourse of wine, quote, decent and, quote, drinkable, get you only so far. Cheers, Alder. And then my final response. Alder, thanks for taking the time for this response, and I ask if you'd like me to include it. The point I was making didn't really dig into the recent history of the invention of chemical sprays, but I don't think my perspective suffers for not mentioning it, though your response makes me think I should say something. What I would say is that we live in a very different world than the one in which our relationship with vinifera began and developed. Once globalization began with intercontinental trade, vinifera began to and continues to be forced to contend with new fungal pathogens beyond what it had ever experienced in its history. Powdery, downy, black rot, anthracnose, etc. And then there's phylloxera. Vinifera has failed to thrive since then and only became a viable global commodity crop after the chemicals were developed and after grafting onto hybrids and natives. This actually reinforces my point. Also, I don't see vinifera culture as what you mainly describe as the indigenous wine cultures of Europe and Western Eurasia. Vinifera culture is the cultural colonialism that Europeans engaged in to create the global vinifera monoculture, which is infused with Eurocentrism and vinifera chauvinism. Don't get me wrong, I think that something closer to love of vinifera rather than enforced prejudice has motivated the global spread of vinifera, especially as you describe our long relationship with it that we are rightly unwilling to abandon. But, quote, we are Europeans in this case, and as we look at generally how cultural superiority was also infused with European spread around the globe, I see this still in the, quote, critical establishment that you reference. Taste is learned, and taste is tied to culture. The critical establishment has been trained on vinifera, steeped in vinifera culture, so a preference for its flavors is not a surprise and is a self-reinforcing loop. What I think being within the dominant perspective makes us blind to is how dominant it is. It's nice to say hybrids deserve a chance, but it becomes meaningless unless we actually value them. That doesn't mean we have to quit vinifera, but it means we have to quit gatekeeping hybrids, and I think ecological reasons are urgent reasons we should. It's quite easy to point to superior flavors in Chardonnay compared to, for example, Brianna. But we have Chardonnay growing in thousands of locations around the globe, made into thousands of different expressions of wines by thousands of different winemakers. It's easy to find great examples that seem to be in a different league than the best Brianna available. But what isn't simultaneously acknowledged is that it's also easy to find examples of terrible Chardonnay that also seem to be in a different league in the other direction. We just don't have as many examples of Brianna, probably not even hundreds. So while I do agree that we need to hold hybrids to the same standards of quality flavor, at this point in history, we are not judging them by the same standards. We're comparing the Yankees to the Bad News Bears and declaring the Yankees a far superior team. They are, but... analogies only get us so far. Again, thanks for your time, Adam. So there you have it. That is our exchange. Alder did not respond back other than to say he would be fine with me including his email on the podcast as I am now. And I will leave it at that. And I appreciate you all so much for listening. Thank you. Hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you joining in to these podcasts. If you'd like to support these podcasts, probably the best way to do that is to just join Substack as a paid subscriber at beyondorganicwine.substack.com. It also gives you access to all the paid episodes and other content that I will be releasing on Substack. And I also want to thank Cold & Pro for this beautiful closing music.